what I want to try and do is spend a bit of time talking about Britain in the 1920s, what sort of place it was when they did this census. Then I want to discuss the project to digitize the 1921 census and what you're going to find, and then how to search the census. And we'll finish up by looking at some of the fun discoveries we've made and hopefully help you make some of your own. So what was this place like in Britain, in England and Wales in the 1920s? There's some images here, but let me just try and think, if you can, of a world just coming out of a global pandemic, a nation beset by protests, civil and industrial strife, distrust in politicians at an all-time high, members of the government accused of corruption and taking backhanders, parts of the UK on the verge of independence. Can you imagine a world like that? Joking aside, this is an example which will show you just how big the pandemic was at that time with the Spanish flu, the Asian flu that they were dealing with. This is a form, a 1921 census. You can see the staining right across it. And there's a little note written by the person filling out the form to explain what's going on. And he writes, "We had a slight accident with the crude carbolic in the course of necessary disinfection of all transmissions and exchanges," because of course they were in the midst of the flu pandemic. But whilst the whole period might sound quite familiar in some ways, given what we've been through ourselves, it was also very different in one fundamental way. The country had just come out of a war that left over 1 million people dead. There were another 2 million who came back from that war with permanent injuries, disabilities. 192,000 widows were left. 360,000 children were made orphans. So this was the backdrop, and you can see that being reflected in the returns as well. Here's a cartoon we discovered on one of the census returns. I'm going to zoom in because it's really hauntingly prescient. The drawing you'll see is drawn by a veteran of the First World War, and it shows 3 officials sitting around a table, all with their top hats. They're being served tea, and there's a note saying they're using the census to count available cannon fodder from the census returns in 1921, because the next war will be in 1936. It's eerily prescient. But it was also a period where everybody was being promised by their politicians an extraordinary transformation because of the war. David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, declared that he was going to build a land fit for heroes. This phrase, the land fit for heroes, is repeated ad nauseum by politicians. And you can see this reflected in the returns as well, because people are outraged that this hasn't happened. Nearly 14% of the population were living 2 families to a dwelling. 6%, there were 3 or more families per dwelling. There was a serious housing crisis, massive unemployment. It was a very serious time. You can also find out about this housing crisis from the reforms themselves. There's something I'm going to point out to you a few times during this talk, but in the bottom left-hand corner of every form, the enumerators calculated the number of rooms that could be found in that home. Now, they didn't count bathrooms. Now, bear in mind, most people didn't have indoor bathrooms back then, and they also didn't count kitchens. But you can get a sense of how affluent the family might be. But this outrage and anger at the lack of housing, at the appalling treatment of people, veterans from the war, is reflected in so many returns. You see all sorts of comments. Here's a classic one. It's the nation's duty to provide houses. And they call him Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, is hereby requested to bring forth that land fit for heroes. Here's another example. Out of work, now living in the land fit for heroes. Stop talking, start building. Here's another one. 5 persons living in one room. Stop telling us about your homes for heroes and start building some houses and let them at a rent a working man can afford to pay. You can feel the anger coming off the page with so many of these returns. And of course, the census itself caused anger of its own. Here is one saying it cost, is that 500 billion or 500 trillion? It's an enormous amount of money, and we won't forget it. Or here's more examples. This is quite different anger as well, because during the war, all of the industry and all of the various different occupations had to be filled by women because the men had been sent to the front. At the end of the war, 750,000 women were made redundant. Their services no longer needed. And this particular return is written by somebody, a man, I'm sure, who says it is disgusting that the unemployed ex-soldiers should be deprived of government work by appointing women enumerators, and an insult to send these women to the ex-soldiers' houses with census papers. So you can see all sorts of anger and disgruntlement. But they were also angry at the way the census was done itself, because the census had advertising. This had never happened before. In fact, it never happened again. But the cost of printing the census, and also the change, because of course it was delayed, which I'll explain in a moment, it costs a lot of money. So they ended up selling advertising to the Sunday Illustrated newspaper, which was a Sunday rag. But it wasn't any old Sunday rag. It was a Sunday rag owned by the MP Horatio Bottomley, who wasn't a popular man, neither was his newspaper. So you have many of the census returns give out about this. I protest against advertising the gutter press in this enclosure, and so on. You can see all these comments written on it. The funny thing, of course, about this is that Horatio Bottomley had his comeuppance because he was arraigned on fraud charges and expelled from Parliament and imprisoned for 5 years. And as a consequence, advertising has never appeared on the census return again since then. Now, that's a bit of a background to give you a sense of the flavour of a ferment that was England and Wales at the time of the census. And the census happened on the 19th of June, 1921. Now, it's important to keep that date fixed in your mind because it's not the date that's on the census forms. The date on the census forms is April because that's when they were supposed to have it. I'll explain in a moment. There was also a pamphlet issued with the census, and it's really interesting to see what it was that they were expecting to find out from the census. And I'll just read some of this out here. The war has cut clean across every branch of our national life, broken up and disrupted populations and violently upset all birth, marriage and death rates, so that there is hardly a single question upon which we can look back to the last census figures for any guidance. So the country had been transformed. Now, they did intend to have the census in April, the same sort of time they normally had it. But the country was, as I said, seething. And they were convinced there was going to be a general strike. In fact, there was going to be a general strike, which was only called off at the last minute because wages were low. There was so much unemployment. There was such a dreadful disgust at this failure to bring forth the land fit for heroes. So instead, they postponed the census and they had a summer census. Now, a summer census has consequences, which is important for your research. For starters, it means that certain locations were suddenly ballooned in population, seaside towns like Brighton and Torquay, Blackpool, Southend, because in 1921, we start seeing the growth of this new phenomenon, holidays, going away for more than just a couple of days, but for a week or even 2. And this wasn't limited to the elite, the rich. This was a pastime for large sections of the middle class, the skilled working class, even amongst labouring people could get away for a period of time. So don't be surprised if your family is not at home in the 1921 census. They could be on holiday. Your ancestor may be in a guest house or a hotel. So the census reminds us of one of the critical things about censuses in general. They're a frozen point of time rather than recording what usually happened. So the census asks you where you are, not where you live. Who are you with, not who's in your family. Just keep that in mind because we can get confused sometimes. Also, what's not included? Well, it's the census of England and Wales. We know that. That also includes the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands and a few other islands around the England and Wales. But it doesn't include Ireland which was supposed to have its own census in 1921, but of course that was postponed, but for a little bit longer because we were right in the midst of the War of Independence, or the Civil War, depending on which perspective you're coming from. But I'm in Dublin, so it's the War of Independence from me. It was delayed until 1926. Scotland also had its own census in 1921, and with any luck, their census will get published later this year. The British Armed Forces in Ireland and throughout the Empire were included, but not the British Armed Forces in Scotland. They were included in the Scottish census. You also won't find merchant navy and fishing vessels which were not in port at census night, or didn't come back to port pretty soon thereafter because they were picked up as well. So just keep in mind what's not included. Now, the project. The 1921 census project, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the project we've just completed, because it's a fairly major piece of work and it's also misunderstood as well. And I think it's worth explaining it so everybody's in the know. Just to give you some background, back in 2018, the National Archives went out to find a commercial partner to digitize and transcribe the 1921 census of England and Wales. And Findmypast won that tender. In fact, there were only two competitors at the end, ourselves and a rather larger, well-known company in the family history space. And we were very proud to have won the tender to do it, and even more proud to have completed it on time. Now, to give you some background, we were tasked to do it without any expenditure of public monies. We had to pay for all of it. It was a multi-million-pound investment and carried quite a lot of risk for Findmypast, but we were very happy to take it on board because we knew it would work well. And the project took 2.5 years to conserve, digitize, and transcribe this material, which I'll describe in a bit. Now, you've got to remember, we did that through the pandemic. Our operation in Titchfield was shut down more than once for extended periods of time, and our transcription partners' facilities in India were shut down extensively. So this was quite some achievement to get it done on time. Now, how big is this collection? I want to give you some sense of scale because it's enormous. There are 28,000 volumes containing 300 to 600 household schedules in each. If you lined up those schedules end to end, they'd travel 3,000 miles, 4,500 kilometers, the distance between London and Boston. It took over 7,000 days just to digitally image this material. And we were capturing at such a phenomenal rate. I mean, we were capturing up to 40,000 images per day. And the total volume of this was huge. We only finished imaging in September of last year. And of course, more had to be happened. You've got to remember, this collection wasn't like dealing with any old collection. This is what they call in archival circles an open collection. They're open documents. What that means is they're still live. That means they're covered by data protection legislation, by GDPR. Under GDPR and data protection legislation, you cannot release any information about somebody who is less than 100 years old or is not conclusively dead. And of course, we were dealing with materials before that. And that had huge implications because there was no derogation or allowance for us to actually handle the material in a different way. We had a very limited number of people imaging who could actually look at the originals, but nobody else. Our transcription partners were not allowed to see an entire return. We had to split up the returns into 3, and they did 1/3 of each return at different times, so they didn't have full visibility of a full return at any given moment to protect that privacy. And you may laugh, well, there's only 2 or 3 or 2.5 years or 6 months left, but that's the law. So that was actually a very complex process. And then after we only started the transcription, sorry, the cleanup process, because of course after transcription there's always a cleanup process. We could only start that I'm going to go back a slide, sorry. We only started that in October of last year because we were not allowed to decrypt the transcriber's work until October. That was the rules. So we only had a very short time to do cleanup work. And in fact, we're continuing to do cleanup work on the collection. I'm going to show you a couple of typical weeks we've been involved in. The week of the 3rd of February, for example, we cleaned up all the names of the ships and the barracks. We also cleaned up surnames, unusual surnames. We dealt with gaps, which we found missing fields, but also we found some other corrections. We started dealing with the big problem of Welsh returns, which are often in Welsh and which our transcription partners had a bit more difficulty with than others. We're doing good headway now at fixing that stuff. The week of the 8th of February, we checked every single place name in the collection and standardized to make sure they're cleaned up. We dealt with so many other materials. So this is happening week after week after week, and this will be an ongoing project for years, because it's not only work we're doing, we're also taking back what you're telling us to try and make it better. But despite all of that, when we were launched in January, we had achieved 98% accuracy, which is what we were required to do. In fact, we've done quite a bit better than that. And 98% accuracy is at character level. And if you think about it, there are about 150 characters per entry. So there's going to be 2 or 3 errors, spelling errors, or 2 or 3 letter errors, typically in every entry. That's what 98% accurate means. Now, I also want to deal with the commercialization side of it, because some people don't like the fact they have to pay for this. I can understand that. There are some countries in the world which have made a strategic decision to actually make genealogical information available for free to everybody. In fact, I can only really think of one country that's done that, which is Ireland, but that is unusual, and there's reasons for that, and we can discuss it afterwards if you're interested. But this was decided to follow through commercially, but this is a decision taken by the National Archives. And the reason why they did this is because they have a huge strategy they're engaged in now called the Archives for Everyone strategy, which needs to be paid for. And they viewed this as being an important way of facilitating that project, so they could actually reinvest that money back into making other archives more easily available. So at the moment, to see the 1921 census, it costs £2.50 to look at a transcription, or £3.50 to look at an image. You can get a discount if you're a Findmypast subscriber, and I'll tell you more about other ways we can actually try and minimize that cost, try and simplify getting to the right entry so you don't waste money, and I'll give you some good tips on that. Okay, so how did we do this? How did we digitize this material? How did we take these boxes of registers and turn it into this full transcript you see here? That's the entry for David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister I mentioned already. Well, I'm going to step you through it quickly. For a start, we had to conserve the collection. This collection hadn't been opened since it had been packed away in 1926, I think. So we had to take it out. We had to flatten creases. We had to repair tears in it. We had to remove dirt and dust. There was water damage on a significant amount of the collection, which nobody had realized before, so we had to try and fix this up. We had a team of conservators working on all of the papers first before they went into the next stage, which was to digitally image them. Now, a sizable majority of the collection could actually be sent through a very sensitive sheet-fed process. These are very good paper that this stuff was printed on, which is great because we could use a sheet feeder, but even still, there was very careful procedures around that. A significant percentage, though, had to be digitally imaged from above, so that was also carried out too, and you can see some of the images of the processes that we did. And after that, then we had to split those images, as I said, into 3 segments, send them to our transcription partner in India, who then worked through it. And this all was happening contemporaneously with each other over the course of the 2.5 years we worked on the project. And there are 46 different fields captured for every single entry. Then after that, we had to put the stuff online. And as I said, we finally got the collection decrypted in October of last year. Anyway, that's an introduction to what we've done. I could spend quite a lot of time talking about it, the stuff we found, not least of which the number of insects we found from the time. But what will you find in the census? This is what you're interested in. But let me give you a tour of the census returns themselves, because every census in every country varies. And this isn't the same as the 1911 census of England and Wales. It's different again. And it's important to see. So, the left-hand side of the form, you're asked the name of each person and their relationship to the head of household, not the relationship to the previous person in the entry, the relationship to the head of household. That's an important distinction. Then they were asked for their age, and unusually for the first time, they gave their age in years and months. And the reason why they did this is because the census enumerators had discovered that people tended to rush out their returns. They didn't spend time on them. They weren't expecting, you know, all of you to be looking at these 100 years later. They just, was an annoying bureaucratic thing they had to do, so they filled it out. So they would regularly just round up their age, call themselves 30 rather than 28 or whatever, you know. So they recognized the problem here. So they wanted to get more accurate ages. They gave their sex, male and female. It was a lot easier then than it is now. They also gave their marital status and whether children were orphans or not. So the children would write exactly how many of their parents were alive or dead. And that's significant because they never asked that before. In terms of marital status, it was also the first time they asked whether you were divorced, which caused some consternation, as we'll find out. You were also asked your birthplace and separately your nationality. And if you were born in England and Wales, you are asked for the county you were born in and the place within the county. If you're not born in England and Wales, you're asked for the country and then the county or place equivalent. And the nationality, again, it was quite specific. You had to be British born, naturalized British, British subject, or some other nationality. And for those of you who are interested, the largest nationalities who were not born in England and Wales were, any guesses? Well, I'm hoping somebody out there got it. The Irish. They're the biggest group. 360,000 Irish-born people in the English and Welsh census, followed very closely by the Scots with 340,000. After that, the next biggest group were those people who were born elsewhere in the British Empire. A very significant number of people who were born in India. Now, I would suspect the majority of those are of British heritage as opposed to those of Asian heritage, but there's still a significant number of non-British who are already settling and migrating. The biggest group or the biggest nationality from continental Europe are actually Russians. Nearly 60,000 Russians born in Russia are recorded. Over towards the right of the census return, you're asked for the occupation, which again, we would have seen before. But for the first time, you're asked for your place, your employer's name, your place of employment. That's quite new, and that's really significant, and it's very, very welcome additional piece of information. And if you're out of work, you had to record who you had last worked for, which is good and very useful too. So these additional questions are quite important. Also, there were other distinctions made around occupations. For the first time ever, they recognized that women who were working in the home were actually conducting real work, and that needed to be recorded somehow. In fact, it was argued by Mr. Vivian, who was actually the chief in charge of the census, that actually performing home duties, as it was called, was probably more hard work than most men carried out. That must be a first of that recognition. And I think I've explained some of the other things that are listed here as well, some of these other changes. But the very far right-hand side of the form, you're asked for the number of dependents you had. That's not just simply the number of children, but the ages of those children as well. And so if you, and then on the front of the form, the other side of the page, you put in your address. So that thing about dependents, though, is quite complicated and got quite a lot of people confused. And you can see where they've been crossed out by the enumerators because they didn't fill it in correctly. So the enumerators often fixed this part of the form. There's more examples of that being got wrong. Now, this was the 1921 census is different from the 1911 census in two ways, which is worth knowing about. For a start, the 1911 census asked a fertility question of all women. They asked whether they were married, and then whether they had any children, and then how many were alive and how many had died. That question went. There was also the question in the 1911 census of what infirmity you might have. That's a fun one. It's fun. I'll explain why I say it's fun. In Ireland in 1911, I've been through the 1911 census for Ireland quite closely, and the number of women who put in under the infirmity column the inability to vote as being their infirmity, I thought was hilarious. But I love the way that people use census returns as a way of expressing their opinion. So remember that when you're filling in your next census return, put something in there that your descendants might find interesting. Anyway, the big thing about the census is it was all on one sheet of paper, one form. It's quite extraordinary. There's a huge amount of information in it. You can see it there. As you can see, as you look across it, on the left, you have the names and the relationship to the head of household. Then you have their place of birth. Then you can track down their place of birth when you've actually got it, of course. Then you find out whether their employment is over in this part of the form. You'll find out the place they work in. This person worked in Rolls-Royce, so you can go and track down their place of work. And then, of course, you find out where for that place of work they were in. And then finally, over on the right-hand side, you get the dependents being listed. You'll also notice numbers start appearing, green handwritten numbers. These are the enumerators' codes. They coded everything because they wanted to get really precise statistical information. And the employment codes are particularly useful because sometimes it's difficult to read these things, but they actually went out of their way to try and make sure that everybody gave a precise form of employment, not just a generic. So, for example, it wasn't just nurse. You might be a sick nurse, or you might be a wet nurse, or whatever. But you had to define exactly what your employment was, and that employment was then captured as a code, which you'll see in green ink. You'll see these codes here. Good news is we've got those codes on the site. You can go and find out what those codes are, and actually find out exactly what they're supposed to be. And that's really useful. It makes your job a lot easier in trying to understand these things. There's also scheduled types. You'll notice when you're doing a search, you can actually choose a scheduled type. This is relatively easy to understand, the codes they used. Generally speaking, there's a single letter for England and Wales, and the more letters of the same beside each other means the bigger the return it was, the number of people. And of course, then there was particular codes for prisons, P, institution, I, vessels, S, and so on. Now, there were 38,000 enumerators. Did they always get it right? Did they always follow the rules? Most of the time they did, but not always. For example, they often would get little details wrong, so just be aware of that. It's not that common. Or, for example, here's a case where we've discovered where a family should have been given another sheet to fill in because the household was quite big, but they weren't. So the family themselves just filled it in on a blank piece of paper they had, and the enumerator didn't bother retranscribing it back out into a form, so we just had something like this. Now, we transcribed it as normal, but you know, that will happen occasionally. And for those of you who are tracking vessels, ships, there's a whole different form used for those, which has a huge amount of detail on both sides of the sheet, which is worth knowing about. So you're in for a treat if you're trying to track somebody who's on a ship or who is involved in shipping in any way, shape, or form. Similarly, the prisons have a different form that they filled in. It's a different schedule. So it has a different flavor. It looks a bit different, and the questions are a little bit different. Institutions are the same, whether they're universities or hospitals or workhouses or even, you know, religious institutions. I mean, they had a different form they filled out. Here's one for the Chelsea pensioners, and there's a great picture of them all lined up. In the institutions, you often have abbreviated names. It's worth being aware of that. I mean, there's a lot of them have abbreviated first names, sometimes abbreviations for both names. Thankfully, it's very few abbreviations for both names, but you know, it does happen and it can be frustrating. So how do you search the 1921 census on Findmypast? Well, when you come to the site, pretty easy to find it. You can search the census without having a subscription, by the way. You don't need to have a subscription to Findmypast to look at the census. This is why it's pay-per-view, because the National Archives wanted it to be open to everybody, whether they had a subscription to us or not. But you can see that there's a number of buttons which will bring you to the 1921 census, and you can either search by person or you can search by address. And I'll talk about address searching in a little bit, but I want to look at the person searching, which I think is probably what all of you will want to do first, or you may have done already. If you see on the left-hand side under the advanced search here, there are a lot of fields you can search with. I mean, a huge number, and you need to spend some time getting to grips with that. But the one piece of advice I would give you and give anybody is start broad and then go narrow. Start with a name, possibly year of birth, and see what you come back with. Because, you know, in the case here, we put in Ruth May Girling, and not even a year of birth. We've already only got four results. You're narrowing it very fast. So don't try and fill it all in. Just start with it broadly and narrow it down. When you do decide to narrow down, you'll be able to narrow down in so many different fields. Here's an example. You can put in the birth country. I mean, as I said before, there are people from all over the world in England and Wales. For me, it was a bit joyous because I don't have a single English or Welsh grandparent. They're Irish and Scottish and Canadian and God knows what else. But 3 of my 4 grandparents are in the census, even though they weren't born there. They weren't even really living there. They just all happened to be visiting it. I'm just terribly lucky. And there's lots of other forms. For those of you who want to do more sort of like community-based research, or you're looking for very specific things, all of this coding that I talked about before is included within their search. You can go into the exact piece number. You can actually look in a much more detailed way, and forensic way, if you wish. And when you do get your results, search results coming back, here, for example, that Ruth Girling search you were doing there, you'll notice these 2 buttons on the right-hand side beside every single search result. And one is for the transcript, and the other one is for the image. These are the point at which you'll get charged. Everything up until that point is free. You can search to your heart's content without paying a penny. And you can discover quite a lot, as I'll explain in a bit. But let's have a look at this, the transcripts and the images. We'll start with the images because let's face it, that's the best part of this whole thing. So let's look and see what the images looks like. This is what they come up looking like on screen. They're full color images. You have a lot of different controls over looking at images. You can recenter the image, you can zoom in, zoom out, you can change the brightness and contrast, invert the color, print it out, download it, rotate it, add it to your tree. You can do lots of different things with the image. You can also hover over any of the entries and it'll come up with a transcript if you're having difficulty reading it. So I always suggest you go straight to the image if you find an entry you're interested in, because you're going to get everything there anyway. The transcript is only useful for searching and also for where it's difficult to read. But more importantly, bear in mind the strip at the very bottom of the screen, the thumbnails. You see the button beside thumbnails, it says extra addresses. If you've bought an image, you've also paid for the extras too. Look at the extras. They're valuable for your research. The extras include the front page of that volume, which included the return you're looking at. It also includes the other flip side of the form, which is where you find the address, which is up there, which gives the name and the address of the person you're looking at. It'll also give you 2 maps of the map of the district that was included in the census, with lots of details about what was included, places included, and it gives you a text description of the enumeration district. These are all part of that individual image purchase you might have made. So you grab all those as well. And of course, if you forget to do these things and you come back later, just go into the My Records section of the website, and all of the things you previously paid for will always still be sitting there. Now, the transcripts, I'm going to run through quickly what you'll find in the transcripts. You'll get at the very top of the page, you'll have your links to the image, and then just below it, you'll have all the household members listed with a summary of information about them. And at the bottom, you get the full transcript for the single person in the household you're focusing in on. I'm going to look at one example. I'm going to be quite cheeky and just choose my granddad, who happens to be in the 1921 census, as I suggested. He wasn't born in England. He was born in Dublin in Ireland. He was in the Royal Navy, and he was on holiday in 1921 with his mother and his 2 sisters, who went to go and stay in Suffolk, which happened to be where his mother was born. So obviously they'd gone down to visit family, maybe. We don't know. That's a story I need to go and find out more about. But he was there in a guest house, and here's the guest house he was staying in. In fact, if we look at it, you'll see on the left-hand side, these are all the people in that guest house. They're all visitors staying there. There's an equal number of visitors and servants, which always is interesting. And on the right-hand side, you'll see all of the information just about him. Now, you won't be able to read it, but I'm just trying to give you an idea of just how much information there is about each individual person. 46 fields of information were transcribed. Now, if you're looking at the transcript, scroll down after the transcript of the fields of information I mentioned here, because we'll also give you a contemporary map of the exact location you're looking at. For example, in this case here is the guest house he was staying in Blackheath Wood in Suffolk, which was quite a favoured location apparently at the time. We've also then got examples of local newspapers where he was, and you'll see a little bit of a clue as to why the 1921 census didn't happen in Ireland. British troops have been trapped in another Irish ambush as part of the War of Independence. But if you scroll down again after those things, which you can zoom in and out of course, you're going to see some statistics from that specific location you've looked at. What is the age breakdown in the region? What's the average number of people per household? What's the population of the area? What are the major occupations? And what's the difference among the different percentage by gender? And this is really telling, because if you look at the ages between 20 and 35 or 20 and 40, there's a huge discrepancy between men and women because so many men had not come back from the war. So do keep on scrolling. Look at everything you're getting. Don't just skimp over it. Also, what we've tried to do is when you find an employer, we'll give you a button you can press to find out who else worked for the same employer or had the same occupation in the area, which is quite useful. You'll see here that's finding everybody who's working in the same biscuit manufacturer, for example, because these would have been their colleagues and friends. It gives you clues as part of your research. Now, when you look at the transcripts, can I bring your attention as well to a little comment at the bottom. You'll see what comes up from a transcript is the first 5 members of a household. You'll notice there's 8 more rows here. Click on that to get the rest of the rows. This is the household of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame. And of course, if you click on the more rows, you'll find that it's not just himself, his wife, his 2 sons and daughter. They've got quite a large body of servants and also visitors, friends, I'm sure, who were staying with them at the time. Obviously, Arthur Conan Doyle had been quite successful as an author of the day. Also, you'll see another button on the transcript, which is report an error. If you find a mistake, please do let us know. Or if you discover this error before you've even looked at the transcript and you want to avoid paying for the transcript, totally understandable, you'll see an email address down here, transcriptsupport@findmypast.com. Please send an email to us and alert us to the fact, and we will fix it in the next round of updates we do from our users' suggestions. Now, how about looking for a place rather than a person, an address search? Well, that's straightforward enough. You need to go to the search button and you'll see addresses here. If you click on that, you'll then be able to select the 1921 census, or for that matter, any census from 1841 onwards, and including the 1939 register as well, and put in a street name or a place name, and we'll be able to find out what households were staying there. For example, this is Baker Street. You've got 4 results for the same street. The reason for that is the fact that the street's quite a long street. Baker Street, even just Upper Baker Street, crosses over a number of different registration districts. And of course, these are grouped by registration district. But if you choose one of those, you'll then be able to find the individual house numbers and the street, and you can go and look at the original return. So you can be nosy, because I mean, I like being nosy. I'd like to find out who was living in this house in 1921. I wouldn't mind knowing who was living in my neighbours' houses in 1921 too. It's great fun being nosy, historically anyway. Okay, further on, here's an example from an address search. This is Dorothy Elizabeth Levitt, who I always think is a great example and rather unexpected at this time, because not only was she quite a famous author in her own right, she was also a pioneer motor racer. At a time when there weren't very many motor racers, let alone women who were doing that. Anyway, the costs, I mentioned before about the cost for a transcript and the image. You'll also get a 10% discount on either of these prices if you have a subscription at Findmypast as well, a 12-month subscription. We're doing a promo which will get you a 21% discount over a 12-month pro subscription if you use the promo code ROADSHOW. Because this presentation I'm giving you is part of a roadshow we're doing all over Britain and internationally on this release. Anyway, let me give you some search tips. to try and minimize the number of these returns you might need to pay for, because there are clever tips and tricks you can do to make sure you're choosing the right one. Do you remember we were looking at Ruth Girling, that example? Well, if you hover over each of these 4 examples here, what you'll find, and you'll notice that it also tells you the other family members who can be found in that return. Now, you haven't paid for anything here. This is simply in your search results. So hover over every entry to get other names, to try and make sure you've got the right person. Can I also suggest you look at the learn more search tips and useful links at the very top of the search screen, because these will bring you to an awful lot of information about the census. Understanding the census will make it better, your results better that you find. You can also then find those occupation codes, there's other types of codes that I mentioned before, which will allow you to narrow down your search to be really precise. There are a couple of other things which are useful in terms of searching too. There is an optional keyword field where you can just put in whatever keywords you might like, and we'll see what comes up. You can use wildcards, asterisks, which you can use to replace a word or a character or a selection of characters. And also the location search tool we have, which is this bar, this green bar you'll see on the screen. You can then choose a location and then choose 5 miles from it, 10 miles, 20 miles, and so on. Now, so also remember again about that information about the number of rooms in the house, that box at the bottom left-hand corner, that one right down there. Well, that's what it tells you. This family here had 9 rooms. So they're obviously doing quite well. I wonder whose house that is. It's J.R. Tolkien's house. I was so delighted when I discovered this. It was a real thrill. But he was doing quite well. I mean, he was a Oxford Don, young Oxford Don too. Anyway, what discoveries have we found that you might find interesting? You'll find many more. These are just a few examples I'd like to finish with. Okay, I'm interested in the Irish who are there, so I went for probably the most famous Irish person who was in England and Wales in 1921, who had to be George Bernard Shaw. He's often considered the most important dramatist and cultural influence since Shakespeare. I suspect it was him who thought he was. Anyway, I don't know about that. He was certainly a fine polemicist, an astute observer of human behaviour, certainly a contrarian and a raconteur, and he was also Irish. He was from Dublin, he was born there, and his wife, Charlotte Frances Shaw, was born in Cork. So let's have a look at their return and we can see what you're finding out. It's a good example. As you can see, all the names are given on the left-hand side. The relationship to the head of household is just George Bernard Shaw and his wife, along with all their servants, because they don't have any children. And you'll see where they're born. You'll see that there's a code 15X beside both of them. That was the code 15X was for the country, new country called Southern Ireland. It never came into existence, really. It was replaced by the Irish Free State after the end of the War of Independence, or Siirstad Éireann, depending on which language you were speaking. Northern Ireland was 14X, was the code they used for it. Northern Ireland, of course, did come into existence. There was a parliament called, and it continued into existence to the current day. As you move across the form, you'll see the occupations and all the occupational codes. Of course, George Bernard Shaw is an author, and he works on his own account. He's self-employed, and he works at home. His wife works at his home duties, and then all of their servants, of course, work directly for them. So it's all clear there, but all of their different occupations have got codes as well. And they've also got their number of rooms in the bottom left-hand corner. And you'll see the number of people, and they've got 10 rooms. They're doing quite well indeed. Now, here's another example. This is fun. I don't know how well known this would have been known in New Zealand, but certainly this was Captain Tom was a much loved figure during the pandemic in England. He's recorded as a year and 1 month old. He was a veteran of the Second World War, and he used to walk with his Zimmer frame to raise money for the NHS, for the health service during the pandemic, which he did an extraordinary job. Here's Alan Turing, somebody who I have great respect for. He was a computer scientist and code breaker in World War II, and he's a young boy here in 1921. Or famous Virginia Woolf, who's recorded here in 1921. alongside her husband and various household servants. Or here's Alfred Hitchcock. He's listed here as the title designer for a film company, unnamed. Or Hetty King, who's a famous English entertainer and male impersonator. Quite unusual, but terribly famous in the day, and she's not so well known now, unfortunately. And beyond the famous people, of which of course there's lots and lots more that I'm not mentioning here, I just chose a few. I want to bring you back to the commentary on the returns. This is the thing that I find so exciting, is how much people actually recorded what they thought. God knows I'd love to see more of this. But I mentioned before about the nation's duty to provide houses, but here typically ruined by war, doing odd work. Or I strongly object to the question of divorce being raised on this paper. I believe that divorce is a curse to the country. Felt like moving back to Ireland in the 1970s again. But anyway, that's just, things aren't that terribly different. Divorce was terribly unpopular on the returns, many comments against it. But there's also more light-hearted moments as well. For example, here's baby boy Platt, who is 2 hours old, recorded on the census. Or one that a colleague of mine discovered, which I was so thrilled by this. This is a return with little paw prints. I always see a cat who's wandered, come out of the garden, walked across the census return as somebody's filling it in. It brings it back how this is real. This is a real piece of somebody's life. And of course, it isn't just cats. The dogs are fairly prevalent as well in this, not just sometimes the cats and dogs are even recorded, but this is a wonderful return here in the top left-hand corner. The poor owner who was actually filling in the return had to write this comment, "Dog did this." Obviously, they bit it and ripped the return. Or here's these lovely comments about children, what their occupations were, getting into mischief, getting into worse mischief, emptying feeding bottles. There's an impishness and a humor, anger, outrage, and all emotions are expressed within these returns. And it's wonderful to see that. So I would encourage you all to be just as fulsome in your returns when you're doing them for your descendants' sake. Anyway, that's a brief overview of the 1921 census. I hope you found it interesting.